Hey, hey, don't touch that piano, boy, they shouted across the hall. But the moment his fingers struck the keys, every person who mocked him wished they'd stayed silent. Atlanta had jazz in its heartbeat, but New York had precision. And inside the Holloway Institute of Music, that precision reigned like gospel. Every note, every breath, every polished marble tile demanded perfection. Before the sun even lifted its pale hand over Manhattan, Elias Monroe was already there, pushing a squeaky cart down a corridor that smelled faintly of polish, privilege, and ivory keys. He moved like someone who knew rhythm without needing to chase it. Every sweep of the mop was a quiet phrase. Every turn of his wrist carried an invisible metronome. He was 60, though the curve of his back made him seem older. His uniform was faded, gray around the edges, the Holloway logo nearly rubbed away. Yet his eyes, deep brown, watchful, held a kind of grace that no title or degree could teach. He was invisible here, and that invisibility was deliberate. Students breezed by in tailored coats and $1,000 violins, the sound of laughter echoing off gold-trimmed walls. They barely glanced at him, just another piece of the background like a lamp or a trash bin. The only sound that truly belonged to Elias was the hum under his breath, low, rich, aching with blues. He hummed as he worked, melodies that seemed older than the building itself. Music came to him like air. It never asked permission. He stopped in front of the practice hall, a cathedral of sound, even when silent. At the center of the room sat a black Steinway Grand, gleaming under the soft ceiling lights. Elias paused, drawn to it the way a thirsty man is drawn to water. He looked around, no one in sight, and lifted the piano's fallboard just enough for one key. His fingertip brushed the ivory. A single note bloomed, pure and trembling. It hung in the air like something sacred. Then came the voice, sharp, entitled. Hey! The note shattered. Elias turned. In the doorway stood Tyler Grant, tall, blonde, 21, with the self-assurance of someone who'd never been told no in his life. His bow tie hung loose, his expression one of annoyance, not anger. Don't touch that, he said flatly. That's a Steinway Model D. You'll scratch it. Elias froze, the color draining from his face. His hand slipped away from the keys. Sorry, son. Just cleaning. Tyler smirked, lips curling with mock politeness. Yeah, stick to that. He turned to leave, muttering just loud enough for Elias to hear. These people think they can do everything. Elias's jaw tightened. His throat burned. But he said nothing. He just went back to his mop, slow, steady strokes across the marble floor, washing away the insult with the same rhythm he used to wash away footprints. Through the glass walls, the morning began to bloom, gold lights spilling into the corridors as other staff filtered in. None of them met his eyes. They called him sir only when others were around. But mostly he was just hey or you. In the faculty lounge, two professors sipped coffee from porcelain cups, their laughter trailing down the hall. Did you hear? One said. The dean's hosting the winter gala next week. Full of donors. They'll want everything spotless. The other laughed. Spotless? In this city? Good luck with that. At least the janitor knows his place. Their laughter echoed like a slap. Elias walked past without a word, trash bag in hand. He'd been here 10 years. 10 years of polishing instruments he wasn't allowed to touch. 10 years of listening to students butcher Chopin, while his own fingers, once praised, once applauded, carried only the ache of what used to be. He paused by a classroom door, peering through the glass. A young woman sat at the piano, practicing scales with stiff wrists. The professor barked corrections without rhythm, without soul. Elias whispered under his breath, Relax the shoulders, girl. Let it breathe. She didn't hear him. No one ever did. As he left the room, his reflection caught on the glass. An old black man in a janitor's uniform. But behind the wrinkles and the weary eyes, there was still something else there. A quiet defiance. A rhythm buried under years of silence. He wheeled his cart into the supply closet, the walls closing around him. In the stillness, he hummed again, the melody rising from somewhere deep, a blend of blues and broken dreams. Outside, the students rehearsed their sonatas. Inside, Elias cleaned, unseen, unheard. But that one note he'd touched earlier still echoed in his mind. It hadn't faded. It lingered, like something waiting to be finished. Night came soft and gray over Harlem, and the city hummed with tired electricity. Inside a small one-room apartment above a laundromat, Elias Monroe sat at a wobbly table eating dinner from a chipped white bowl. Beans and rice, the same meal he made most nights. The radiator hissed in the corner, the old pipes groaning like weary ghosts. A small lamp cast a yellow pool of light over the table, where a single-framed photograph leaned against the salt shaker. Elias in his 20s, young and sharp in a tuxedo, smiling beside a white conductor under the golden lights of Carnegie Hall. He stared at it like it belonged to another man. On the tiny TV across the room, a commercial flickered. The announcer's voice was smooth, confident, white. Join us for the Holloway Institute Winter Showcase Gala, a celebration of America's finest young talent. Classical music swelled in the background. Elegant faces, gloved hands, glittering gowns. Elias turned the TV off. The room dropped into silence. He sat there for a while, spoon still in hand, his mind turning over the name Holloway. It was funny, he thought, how life had a way of circling back, even when you prayed it wouldn't. He pushed his chair back and walked to the closet. From behind his spare uniform and a frayed coat, he pulled out a keyboard. Old, half broken, keys yellowed like old teeth. He plugged it in, the faint buzz filling the air, and sat down slowly. His fingers hovered above the keys. When he began to play, the room changed. The first notes were hesitant, like a man remembering how to speak after years of silence. Then came a rhythm, blues tangled with Bach, gospel tied to grief. His fingers, though stiff with age, still remembered. They moved with muscle memory and longing. Music filled the small apartment, spilling out through the open window into the Harlem night. Down on the street, a young woman carrying groceries paused. She looked up, listening. It was classical, but not something deeper, something true. Elias closed his eyes. The melody carried him backward, through decades, through dust and memory. New York City, 1986. He was 24 then, in a black tuxedo, sweat gleaming on his forehead as he sat under the grand lights of Carnegie Hall. The hall was packed. White faces, pearls, polite murmurs. When he began to play Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody, the audience shifted, curious. But then they listened, truly listened. His hands blurred, his eyes fierce. When the final note rang out, the crowd stood, clapping, shouting. A rare genius, the paper said the next morning. A surprise talent from an unexpected source. But beneath the praise was poison. The same paper called him raw, unrefined, and novelty. At the conservatory, whispers followed him like shadows. Too emotional. Too much gospel in his fingers. Too much of himself in the music. Then came the accusation. A white student, jealous, brilliant, and well-connected, claimed Elias had stolen melodies from European composers. The board didn't question it. They didn't ask for proof. They just said, "Integrity matters, Mr. Monroe," and that was that. His scholarship vanished overnight. His name was erased from the yearbook. His mentor, who had once called him a phenomenon, didn't return his calls. He spent years trying to rebuild, but doors stayed closed. By the time he found work again, it wasn't as a pianist. It was as a janitor, at the very school that had expelled him. The memory faded. Elias's hands slowed, the final note trembling in the air. He sat back, breathing hard, tears standing in his eyes. He whispered to no one. They never took the music, though. Down the street, the same young woman lingered, still listening. "Who's playing that?" she asked a man passing by. He shrugged. "Somebody's soul, sounds like." Back at Holloway, Tyler Grant was in the practice room, headphones on, frowning at his sheet music. He missed a note, cursed under his breath, and tried again. But through the window came the faint echo of piano from somewhere far away, rough, haunting, alive. He froze. It wasn't Chopin. It wasn't anything he'd ever heard before. It was human. He stepped to the window, searching the dark, but the sound was gone. Elias closed the keyboard lid gently, like saying goodbye to an old friend. The night pressed against the window, heavy and still. He placed a photograph of his younger self on top of the keyboard. The glass was cracked, his reflection splitting down the middle. Half the man he was, half the man they refused to see. He turned off the light and sat there in the dark, the music still echoing inside him. The city outside kept breathing, and somewhere, deep in the marrow of his bones, Elias knew the song wasn't finished. Not yet. The Holloway Institute glowed like a palace that evening, chandeliers shimmering above polished marble floors, waiters gliding through the hall with trays of champagne, and the faint hum of string instruments floating from the rehearsal room. The Winter Showcase Gala had arrived, the night every student dreamed of and every donor expected to be impressed by. Elias Monroe had been assigned to clean the East Wing before and after the event. He'd polished the floors until they looked like mirrors, wiped every smudge from the glass doors, and set the trash bins discreetly out of sight. He wore his cleanest uniform, still faded, still a size too large, and moved through the corridors like a shadow, careful not to disturb the guests who barely saw him. From the ballroom came bursts of laughter and music. Students in pressed tuxedos and gowns rehearsed near the stage, running scales and whispering nervously. The air buzzed with ambition. Elias stood at the far end of the hall, his mop bucket beside him, pretending to adjust a chord while listening to a young woman's trembling hands stumble through a Chopin waltz. Each note was stiff, mechanical. A teacher nearby said, "Precision, dear, not passion." Elias's head lifted slightly. His lips moved without sound, whispering, "Feel it, girl. Let breathe." He turned away before she noticed. On stage, Dr. Wallace, the dean of the conservatory, was pacing with a clipboard, his tailored suit crisp, his hair lacquered into perfection. "We have donors from the Harrington Foundation arriving in 20 minutes, he barked to the assistants. "Everything needs to be perfect. This night funds our scholarships for the next 2 years. Behind him, Tyler Grant lounged near the piano, smug as ever, talking loudly to a group of students. "You know, the Chopin ballades, not as hard as everyone thinks. You just have to understand European phrasing. Americans, they always get it wrong." The students laughed. A few of them looked nervously toward Elias, who was wiping down a nearby stand. Tyler noticed and smirked. "Hey, Monroe," he called. "Make sure that floor shines. I don't want to slip when I take my bow." Elias didn't look up. "Yes, sir." The words were quiet, but they carried something Tyler couldn't name, something older and stronger than resentment. As the final preparations came together, a sudden commotion rippled through the backstage area. A panicked student burst in, breathless. "Dr. Wallace, Ethan just fainted. He's burning up. I think it's food poisoning." Dr. Wallace stopped pacing. "What? He can't go on," the student said. "He's vomiting in the restroom." Dr. Wallace's face drained of color. The donors are already seated. The ballade in G minor is the centerpiece. "Who else knows it?" Tyler stepped forward quickly. "I do." He adjusted his cufflinks, but his confidence faltered. "Well, most of it." Dr. Wallace's eyes narrowed. "Most? I didn't finish memorizing the coda," Tyler admitted, cheeks coloring. The room went silent. The murmurs of donors filtered in from the ballroom, expensive voices growing impatient. Dr. Wallace rubbed his forehead. "We can't cancel. Someone has to play." Elias stood a few feet away, still and calm, his mop leaning against the wall. He hesitated for a long moment, then said softly, "I know it." At first, no one reacted. Then Tyler laughed. You know Chopin." A few others chuckled nervously. Elias didn't flinch. "Ballade number 1 in G minor. I know every note." Dr. Wallace blinked, unsure if he'd heard right. "Mr. Monroe, are you serious?" Elias met his eyes. Completely. The dean looked around, desperate, weighing humiliation against chaos. "This is a formal performance, not—" "Let him," a woman's voice interrupted. Everyone turned. Professor Lang, Holloway's only black faculty member, stepped forward from the shadows. Her face was calm, her tone unwavering. "If he says he knows it, let him prove it. We're out of time." Dr. Wallace's jaw clenched. The donors were already clapping politely, waiting for the next act. Finally, he sighed. "Fine. If he embarrasses us, it's on you, Professor Lang. Elias nodded once, his expression unreadable. He set down his mop, wiped his hands on a cloth, and walked toward the Steinway. The students whispered behind him, disbelief rippling through the room. Tyler crossed his arms, whispering, "This'll be good." Elias sat down on the bench. His fingers hovered over the keys for just a second, not in hesitation but reverence. The Steinway gleamed under the stage lights, waiting. Dr. Wallace gave a curt nod to the stage manager. "Dim the lights. Announce the substitution." From the speakers, the announcer's voice trembled. "In place of our scheduled performer, please welcome Elias Monroe." The ballroom murmured in confusion. "Who?" someone whispered. "The janitor?" Elias heard it all. He always had. He drew a slow breath. His hands rose, trembling slightly, not from fear but memory. And when the first note came, it was soft, so soft it barely touched the air. But it carried something no one in that room had expected: truth. Within seconds, the whispers stopped. Heads turned. The hall fell still. Elias was playing, and the janitor they had all ignored was about to remind them what music really sounded like. The lights dimmed until only the piano gleamed beneath a single gold spotlight. Every eye in the room was on the janitor, the man they'd never noticed, sitting now where only prodigies were meant to sit. Elias Monroe rested his hands above the keys, breathing in once, twice, letting the air settle like dust before a storm. Then he began to play. The opening notes floated through the air, fragile as glass. They drifted above the audience like whispers, delicate, trembling. But beneath the softness was something alive, a pulse, a quiet storm waiting to break. Within moments, that storm came. His hands moved faster, his body bending with the rhythm, every motion sharp, deliberate, yet graceful. The Chopin ballade rose and twisted through the hall, no longer European, no longer bound by form. Elias made it his own. He bent the melody into something that carried the weight of sorrow and the defiance of survival. It was Chopin filtered through gospel, through pain, through Harlem. Every crescendo carried the ghosts of long nights and broken promises. Every silence between notes was a prayer. The crowd was frozen. Students who had mocked him stared wide-eyed, mouths open. Professors who had brushed past him every morning found their throats tightening, their hands gripping their knees. Even Tyler Grant, leaning against the wall with arms crossed, found himself sinking into the music, confusion etched across his face. This wasn't just technical perfection. It was soul, stripped bare. As Elias played, flashes of memory rippled through his mind, not visions but feelings. His mother's church in Mississippi, the cracked wooden piano she used to play as he sat beside her, his small hands copying hers. The night he was expelled, standing in the dean's office as they told him, "Integrity matters, Mr. Monroe." The sound of a door closing on a dream. Now, decades later, he sat before another door and opened it himself. The melody surged into its final passage, his fingers moving with impossible precision, the kind born only from heartbreak and faith. Sweat glistened on his forehead. He played not as a janitor or a performer, but as a man reclaiming his name. A tremor of light caught the piano surface. For a moment, it looked as though the entire hall was glowing. The chandeliers shimmered. The polished floor reflected the image of an old man's hands moving like fire. When the final chord came, it wasn't a crash. It was a release. The sound lingered, vibrating against the high ceilings, stretching into silence. And then nothing. No clapping, no movement. Just silence, so deep it felt sacred. Elias sat still, his head bowed. For a moment, he thought he'd failed. Then someone stood. Professor Lang. Her hands came together softly at first, one clap, then another. The sound spread like a spark catching dry leaves. Within seconds, the entire room erupted. Applause thundered through the hall, echoing off the marble, rising like a wave. Students shouted. Donors stood. Even Dr. Wallace, stiff and pale, clapped with trembling hands. Tyler's applause came last, slow, uncertain, but real. His eyes were wet, though he didn't understand why. Elias rose slowly, his hands resting on the piano lid. He looked out at the crowd. Hundreds of faces, some ashamed, some awed, all changed. He bowed once. Just once. Then he turned and began to walk off stage. Backstage, Dr. Wallace caught up to him, breathless. "Mr. Monroe, that was extraordinary. Why didn't you tell anyone you could do that?" Elias wiped the sweat from his brow. "You never asked." Dr. Wallace opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Elias picked up his mop, the same one he had set aside 15 minutes earlier, and began to wheel it quietly toward the exit. Behind him, the applause was still roaring. Students surrounded the piano, staring at it like it was something holy. Professor Lang leaned against the wall, tears sliding down her face, tears not of sadness, but of vindication. In that moment, every unspoken rule of the Institute, who belonged, who didn't, cracked like old glass. As Elias stepped into the dim hallway, the sound of his music seemed to follow him, echoing faintly through the marble, rising and falling like a memory that refused to die. Outside, the winter wind was cold against his skin, but he smiled for the first time in years. He had played the truth, and the truth had been heard. The janitor they'd ignored had become the man none of them would ever forget. By morning, the world knew his name again. Videos of the performance flooded the internet overnight. Shaky phone clips from students and donors, all capturing the same impossible moment. An old black janitor sitting at a grand piano, playing like a man possessed, and leaving an entire hall in stunned silence. The captions came fast and furious. The janitor pianist who silenced racism. Hidden genius discovered at the Holloway Institute. They told him not to touch the piano. Then he changed history. News anchors replayed the footage with breathless awe. In a surprise performance that's gone viral, one reporter said, "A janitor stunned the audience at New York's most prestigious conservatory with a rendition of Chopin that critics are calling transcendent." Elias Monroe woke to the sound of his phone buzzing nonstop. He didn't even own a smartphone, just an old flip phone that had never seen so much light. His neighbor knocked on the door, grinning wide. "Elias, you're on TV, man. You broke the internet." He blinked, disoriented, his mind still heavy from sleep. On the TV screen across the room, his own face stared back at him, wrinkled, serious, caught mid-performance. The reporter's voice filled the air. Sources say Elias Monroe was once a promising pianist expelled from the same conservatory nearly 40 years ago. Records suggest he was accused of plagiarism, an allegation many now call racially motivated. Elias turned off the TV and sat in silence. He didn't smile. Fame had never been his goal. Recognition felt strange, heavy, like holding fire in his bare hands. At Holloway, chaos rippled through the faculty offices. The dean's inbox overflowed. Reporters camped outside the gates. Alumni demanded answers. Dr. Wallace stood in front of the board, sweating through his expensive suit. "We had no idea of his background," he stammered. "Of course, we celebrate diversity at Holloway, but..." The chairman interrupted, his tone cold. "You employed one of the greatest living pianists as a janitor, and then let him embarrass you into enlightenment." Social media burned hotter by the hour. Former students began sharing their stories. Racism in grading, favoritism in auditions, opportunities given to legacies, not talent. Holloway's polished image cracked open for the world to see. Even Tyler Grant, once smug and untouchable, posted a shaky video on Instagram. His voice broke halfway through. "I said something cruel to Mr. Monroe. I thought I was protecting something pure about classical music. But I see now, I was protecting privilege. I'm sorry." The apology went viral too. Comments poured in, some praising his courage, others reminding him he'd been part of the problem. Through it all, Elias stayed quiet. He ignored interview requests and speaking offers. He spent most of his days walking through Harlem with his hands in his pockets, nodding at the street musicians on every corner. Sometimes, when they noticed him, they'd grin. "Play us something, legend," they'd shout. He'd smile, shake his head, and keep walking. Then one evening, there was a knock on his door. Professor Lang stood there, wearing her winter coat, a folder tucked under her arm. "You've caused a revolution, Mr. Monroe," she said with a half-smile. "The board wants to meet with you. They're offering you a position, artist in residence, and they want to rename the concert hall in your honor." Elias laughed softly, shaking his head. "Rename it? No, that won't change what it was built on." Lang nodded, expecting that. "Then at least teach. The students need you, the ones who will never be invited to those rooms unless someone like you holds the door." Elias looked past her, out the window, at the city lights. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he nodded once. "All right, but not for them. For the kids who look like me." Months later, the Holloway Institute opened its doors again for another gala, this time called a Night of Truth and Reconciliation. The hall looked different. More faces of color filled the seats, and the stage lights seemed softer somehow. At the center of the hall, a new plaque gleamed beside the others. Elias Monroe, the hands that made silence sing. Elias walked on stage, no longer in a janitor's uniform, but in a simple black suit. His hair was still gray, his hands still rough, but his eyes were alive again. The audience rose in applause before he even played a note. He waited, hands resting gently on the keys until the clapping faded into a hush. Then he began. This time it wasn't Chopin. It wasn't anyone else's music. It was his. The first notes rose slow, heavy with memory. Gospel chords melted into classical phrasing, blues rhythms twined with elegance. It was a song about loss and resurrection, about silence turning into sound. Every note told a story of injustice, of grace, of a man who had been told to clean up genius, but was never supposed to possess it. Students leaned forward, entranced. Some wept openly. Professor Lang closed her eyes, hands clasped in front of her like prayer. As the final notes faded, Elias lifted his hands from the keys and sat still. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything that had ever been denied, now finally returned. He looked out at the audience and spoke quietly, his voice steady. "They told me not to touch the piano, but I did. And when I did, the world listened." The room erupted. People rose to their feet, applause roaring, echoing up into the vaulted ceiling, bouncing off marble and glass until it sounded less like applause and more like thunder. Elias smiled, just a small, tired, grateful smile, the kind that carries a lifetime of truth. He stood, bowed once, and stepped away from the piano. Outside, snow had begun to fall, soft, slow, forgiving. And somewhere in the distance, from a Harlem window, still open to the night, a faint echo of his melody floated into the city air, the sound of a man who had finally been heard. Thank you for watching. We'd like to hear your thought in the comments. Subscribe now and see how ordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.